love live shows of all kinds. I mean, it's a relief to be doing things after years of the pandemic and being on remote. And of course, it's finally possible to do concerts with people who are no longer alive. Now, these are shows that feature holograms of musicians and performers, huge versions of people made of light. And it's a whole new kind of touring industry. You can go to concerts starring singers like Maria Callas and Roy Orbison, and they perform their shows with orchestras and backup bands of actual living people. Now, the Roy Orbison hologram was fairly easy to make. It was done by his 3 sons, who have a company called Roy's Boys, and they toured projections of their father. And it was really easy to make this projection because Roy hardly ever moved during his shows. So they took these shows out on the road, and these, along with several other shows like it, are billed as live shows, even though most of the performers are dead. Now, of course, being dead is no longer really an obstacle to putting out records or going on tour or even, getting Grammys. In fact, it's kind of a plus. Having a music career is often a lot easier when you're dead. Now, by the way, there are also a few hologram shows of live players, but these are shows by the real perfectionists and musicians who are just way too busy to tour. I spent a lot of my childhood hearing about the end of time, the apocalypse, the way it was described in Revelations, fiery and final. Now, my grandmother was a Southern Baptist missionary, and she believed it was her duty to inform as many people as possible about the end times and its rewards and punishments. Now, on the other side of my family were the Swedes, who weren't really that focused on this kind of thing. Now, our church was called the Swedish Evangelical Mission Covenant Church, and it was basically like a coffee church. We'd listen to the sermon, then we'd go down to the fellowship room, and we'd get really wired on coffee. The sermons themselves were actually just some pretty sensible advice about being kind to neighbors and being reasonable, and the rewards that you would immediately receive for acting that way, as well as a lot of stories that Jesus told about wise men and poor men and what to do in certain situations and how to look at the world, just really practical things. Now later, when I began going to Italy, I looked at a lot of paintings and sculptures of Jesus, and they all looked so unfamiliar. In these paintings, he was never shown talking or gesturing or teaching. He was almost always pictured as a little baby being held by his mother, or else he was dead in her arms. Either way, he was not saying a thing. Now, by that time, I was doing a lot of work in Italy and often got booked into churches which were used as theaters when there weren't services going on. So I'd set up all my equipment, keyboards and amps and speakers on these big golden altars. And it was really eerie doing these shows, knowing that right behind me, the whole time, was an enormous, well-lit plaster cast of the crucifixion. So one night, I made what was actually a really tasteless joke. And the joke was, why is it a good thing that Jesus was born in New Testament times instead of Old Testament times? The answer is that in Old Testament times, death was by stoning. And then in New Testament times, death was by crucifixion. So instead of people going like this, they would all be going like this. Which would have changed a lot of things about architecture, for example. So instead of the cross-shaped ground plan, the buildings would be sort of strewn all over, like much more abstract. Now, when I was 26, I decided to stay in bed for until I could think of a really good reason to get up. And I stayed in bed for months. And I would just lie there, look at the sky, and sort of drift. At the time, I could afford to do this because I taught at night school 2 nights a week for about 10 years, and the students were mostly accountants and secretaries on a slow track. And so they would just work all day and then go to school in the evening. So I didn't have to get to work until around 6 in the evening, and mostly the people in this class were really late anyway, and they were all really way too tired to concentrate. Now, I was teaching Egyptian architecture and Assyrian sculpture, but I wasn't really keeping up with the Egyptological journals. So a slide would come up, and I would look at it, and I would draw a complete blank. I couldn't remember a single thing about it. So I would just make things up, about this or that pharaoh, and the students would write it down, and I would test them on it. And I figured that history is so much speculation anyway that it didn't really matter. And so that one of the things that I told them was that in some of the pyramids there were these holes on the exterior in the shape of mailbox slots, and they were connected by a long shaft. And nobody down into the core of the pyramid. And nobody knew why the slots and shafts were there. So what I told the students was that the slots and shafts were oriented to the sun, so that when the sun would stream down the shaft into the inner chamber on the mummy's birthday and shine into the mummy's eyes and wake him up. Now, eventually, I did feel a bit of guilt about this, since this was supposedly like a history course and, not just free-form fiction, so I quit. Not before I was fired, but it was very, very close. There's a story in an ancient play about birds called The Birds. And it's a short story from before the world began. From a time when there was no earth, no land, only air and birds everywhere. Birds making huge patterns in the air. But the thing was, there was no place to land, because there was no land. So they just circled around and around, because this was before the world began. And the seasons were running, and the light was expanding, and the sound was deafening. Songbirds were everywhere, billions and billions and billions of birds. And one of these birds was a lark. And one day, her father died. And this was a really big problem, because what should they do with the body? And it was a big question, and it was a new question. There was no place to put the body because there was no earth. And it went on for 5 or 6 days. And they were all trying to think of what to do with the body. And finally, the lark a solution. She decided to bury her father in the back of her own head. And this was the beginning of memory. Because before this, no one could remember a thing. They were just constantly flying in circles. Constantly flying in huge circles. Now, as you probably all know, 99.9% of the species who've ever lived are now extinct. And the list gets longer every hour. And there are huge databases now that keep track of the extinctions. The list includes massive numbers of civets, big subsets of spotted lizards, every last mastodon, the short-faced bear, the shrub ox, the endless numbers of sloths, not to mention all the dinosaurs, most of the insects, countless birds, and now we've given names to all of them. Really beautiful names in Latin that describe their nature and their lineage. But as they die off, we try to tell their stories. Somehow it's easier to tell the story of the extinction of animals than of people. Like the black forest bear, who used to hibernate all winter, and now he just walks around the woods year round. It gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And so goodbye to the disappeared ones. There they go, hopping and jumping away, swimming and floating away, gone forever.